Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. And what I want to show you today is, well, it's a Horizon Blue sort of World War I inspired Valor Corps infantrymen. Now these are 3D prints. I've printed these at home on my Mars 3, but the maker's cult, they also have Etsy stores and what have you which sell licensed prints. So don't feel as though you're going to miss out if you haven't got a 3D printer. But what I'm going to show you is also applicable to pretty much any Imperial Guard or Astra Militarum regiment that you like. I'm going to show you batch painting, so everything that I do on the one fella that's going to be on camera today will of course happen to all 5 of them. These guys took me about 2.5 hours worth of work, and that includes drying times. So for 5 fellas that look like this, I don't think that's a bad turnaround at all. All of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. So once you've got your fella all assembled, the first thing to do, of course, is to go ahead and prime him. Now, if you are priming something which is going to be predominantly one color, which is largely the case with our fella here, finding a colored primer is generally a pretty good idea, especially if it's one which is easier to paint over the top of. So I'm using here, this is Wolf Gray from the Army Painter. If you can't get the primer, then you could spray him a medium gray or something, and Wolf Gray is available as a paint that you can put a couple of layers over his jacket, and I'd start from there anyway. So that's our first step. Then we're going to move on straight away to dry brushing him, and I've got here Ethereum Blue. Now, you can be quite heavy with this because the shade is going to take it down a fair bit, and for the most part we're almost over brushing it, adding quite a bit. Don't worry if you have a slightly chalky texture, because well, honestly, the texture is part of what I'm doing this for. I want his jacket to look like a slightly rougher cloth. So away we go. You may find that you need to pass over the same area a few times. And as you end up with less on your brush, you'll start getting that chalky texture, which is quite nice depending on what you're doing. So once you're satisfied with this, we can move on. Now, even though that is a dry paint, you want to leave it for a minute or so once it's been applied so that it's got a chance to settle and really stick to the miniature. Obviously, if you're painting in batches, that will not be so much of a problem, because by the time you've finished the 5th or the 10th figure, that first guy is going to be ready to paint again. Now, speaking of, I've got here Baneblade Brown, and I'm going to paint this over his mask. Now, you can be quite messy leading out and away towards the edge of his respirator. Just mind you don't hit his collar. Well, Now, Baneblade Brown will cover surprisingly well for such a light color. But if you do need to, you can apply one coat, paint your other fellas in the squad that you're working on, and then come back and apply a second once that's dry. Now, coverage is what I'm going for most of these colors. I want to keep this as quick and simple as possible, so I don't have to keep coming back and painting over the same areas if I can avoid it. So what I've got here for the leather, this is Flat Brown from Vallejo. You can use Mournfang Brown here instead. Mournfang Brown is going to be a little bit fraction lighter, and this has got a little bit of a red tint to it. You see, I'm not too fussed if I don't get in behind the hand there, but areas that I can reach, of course, I'm going to do a little bit of acrobatics here to paint. Flat brown is my go-to for most leather stuff. And yeah, covers, as you see, extremely well. So I'm going to paint in his gloves and his boots with this. I'll swap to a smaller brush and do in the little... Do I need a smaller brush? Let's paint his things there. And if he's got a pack, I would paint the pack in with this as well. But this will take just a couple of seconds. Now that'll take no time at all. We're going to move on now and start tidying up by painting in his armor. Now here I'm going to use the Fang. Now, some of you might remember when this was called Shadow Grey, and it was a wonderful shade of blue. Well, now it's still a wonderful shade of blue with a different name. This covers very well. As with all of your base paints, of course, you want just a tiny dot of water in there. Mix that in on your palette, make things flow a little more smoothly. On the shoulder pads, you're probably not going to see any streaking, but on a larger area like the helmet, you may find you want to come back and give this a second coat. Now that is 2 coats of the fang, and you'll see it's nice and smooth. Quite a common question is, how do I get things looking so smooth? And the simple answer is, your base coats need to be solid. There's no point shading and highlighting over a patchy base coat because you're not going to rescue it. Make sure that these first things are solid. A little bit of patience now is going to give you a much better basis to work on. So on that note, we'll move on, and I have here Dawnstone. I'm going to use this for his leg wraps. And again, if you've got a fella who is wearing a pack, he's got a blanket or a bedroll or something over the top of it too, you can use Dawnstone to paint that in as well. Now to add a little bit of variety to the color scheme, what I have here is Cavalry Brown from Vallejo. Now what I'm going to paint with this is the small pouches and straps and his belt. Now strictly speaking, you could also paint these with the flat brown we used earlier. And if you want to stick to Citadel paints, then Doombull Brown is a pretty close alternative to this. I'm going to swap to a smaller brush when I paint these straps on his chest. But yeah, this is a wonderful, rich, warm, reddish leather color. Now for the hoses connecting his mask, some folks like to do them in a metallic color, but I always kind of imagine these being like a soft rubberized fabric sort of thing. I have black gray. This is another Vallejo color, but it is a dead ringer for Corvus black. Again, I'm choosing it here because of the coverage. What you can also do with this is just a tiny wee dab of it into the lenses. If you struggle getting this in here, what you can use instead would be Black Templar. Just a little bit of contrast on the end of your brush, you'll find it flows into that gap quite easily. When it comes to metallics, I tend to quite like using a synthetic brush instead of one of the natural ones, because I don't feel so bad about being quite so violent with it. I can really jam it into some of these gaps. I'm using Iron Hand Steel, and I'm going to put this on most of the metallic details. I'm going to skip the buttons for now though, so a little bit like up on his respirator, this section here, most of his lasgun parts, and of course, a fancy little belt buckle lurking up under there. When it comes to black details, I'm using, again, Vallejo black for coverage, but black paint is black. A Baden black will work just as well here. I'm going to paint in the casing on his lasgun. Now, it is up to you. If you want to get fancy, you want to add like a wooden color onto the stock or something, but I like my guys to have a little bit of sci-fi look to them, so I am painting this in black. And since it is the only actual black detail I'm going to apply to him, you might instead choose to use that black gray from earlier, save yourself a paint, or you could even paint it in the fangs so that it matches the rest of his painted equipment, but really up to you. I think a little bit of dark contrast on the front of the miniature is going to work quite nicely. And finally, the last of the base coats we're going to apply is some Corax White. Now, folks have mixed success with this, they tell me. What I would suggest to you is you want to drop a couple of agitators in there and a little bit of Lamian Medium the first time you open that pot. You're going to need to shake the dickens out of it every time you use it, but it is a white that will cover in one go. Now, if you splurge over on the helmet, you can go back with your fang and tidy it up. And that's what you can do past this point anyhow. Once you've got your white details on, any tidy up, clean bits that you've missed, you can go back and do that now before we move on to shading our miniature. So once you've done all your last minute bits of tidy up, it's time to shade the miniature. Now I say all the time, it doesn't matter too much whether you use the Army Painter stuff, Vallejos, Citadels, whatever shade you're using. For something like this, I'd recommend thinning it down rather than using it neat, because if you use it neat, you're going to get quite a change in color. What I want is the shading effect, but I don't want it to completely darken everything down. So what I'm using, this is a half and half mix of strong tone from the Army Painter with their quick shade mixing medium. And I've mixed up a big old bottle of that because I use it all the time. Now this, since they changed the formula, Citadel changed the formula on Agrax Earthshade, the contrast style new shades actually behave fairly similarly to this. So that's a bit of a one to try. What I'm going to do is just bucket this over the entire miniature. Now, with the shade, the quick shade medium in it, this mix will look quite gloopy, and it's a funny old one, because it really does look terrible going on. But you want to apply maybe a little more of it than you would think. And while it's still wet, you can shift it away where you get any big clumps, which you can see are going to dry a little more dark and sinister than you might like. So move it around while it's wet, and yeah, bathe the entire miniature. Once you're done with this, I'll leave it somewhere warm to dry, and we'll come back in about half an hour or so. Of course, being shiny, that's a little bit difficult to see now, but that is what that looks like wet. So it's not encouraging, but let's let that dry. And then what you'll have is something that looks like this. Now, the shade is going to dry quite shiny, and that's also true, I find, of Agrax Earthshade. But don't worry, we live in the 21st century, we have a thing called varnish, and we're going to get rid of that shine. I mention that now because it's up to you whether you do your highlighting now, or if you do that after they have been varnished. I like to varnish everything, so I'm going to do my highlights at this stage. And there is actually only one highlight that we're going to do. I've got here steel. This is a Vallejo model air color, and it is a wonderful, bright, sharp color. Stormhost silver is probably the closest equivalent to this. And what I'm going to do is, instead of highlighting in nice straight lines, let's get them in shot here. I'm going to do little scraggly scratches, just tiny wee dots on the corner of things to make it look as though our weapon has been through the muck and mud, been dinged around a bit in the process. The important thing here is to have just a tiny amount on your brush at a time. You will very quickly lose control of this if you're not careful, so tiny wee driblets here and there. Little chipping motions along the edges of the blue stuff as well, so that we've got a nice metallic finish to our helmets. Try not to go overboard with this, because you'll very quickly just make them silver. But yeah, rather than highlighting traditionally and having to paint a relentlessly straight line along some of these areas, what you can do is just little bits of silver. The same too on the shoulder pads and on the buttons as well. A nice fine brush will help you do those. Now at that same stage, if you're feeling spicy, you can get in and paint the rims on the lenses as well. And then my final stage, I have here Varnish Plus from Instar. A nice brush on. You can use a spray varnish if you like, Tester's Dull Coat, or anything of the like. Just go ahead, matte varnish your entire miniature. And there, as if by magic, suddenly everything comes together. We've taken the shine off, we've got all of that shading, and we still really don't have to do any highlighting if we don't fancy it. You could, if you were going to, I would suggest maybe some Karak stone on the mask, and maybe a little bit of scrag brown on the back of fingers and knuckles. But that's it, For your basic infantry, you don't need to be fussing with everything. And I think that's cool. I'm quite happy with how that's turned out. So what I'm going to do is base him up, and I'll put him next to a few of his mates, which you would have seen earlier, and then the magic happens. And there, all together with his mates, our Valor Corps infantryman is complete. And I hope you can see this properly, because getting them all on the little spinny thing was a bit of a mission. But what I'd like to challenge you is to find the bits that I've missed. There are on each of these guys a couple of parts, normally on straps or around equipment pouches, which technically haven't been painted properly. I have missed a couple of bits, and showing through is the primer. But that's the point of doing units like this. You don't see it. If you do, well, your eye kind of glosses over it fairly quickly, and particularly on the battlefield, on your miniature tabletops, you're just not going to notice it. So don't sweat those little things. As always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paint and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.